Sheriff Warren Briggs slammed the cell door on Jack Sullivan and called it disorderly conduct, though every deputy in the building knew the real offense was that the quiet man refused to explain himself. Less than an hour later, the phone on Briggs's desk rang from a number with no origin. He answered it annoyed. The color drained from his face in 4 seconds. "Sheriff Briggs, this is the White House Situation Room. Listen carefully." Briggs turned toward the holding area. Behind the bars, Sullivan hadn't moved. He was watching the clock. Who had Briggs just arrested? An hour and a half before the phone rang, the front door of the county sheriff's office swung open, and a man walked in carrying a leather bag and a folder. I was 42, dressed plainly, but neatly. The kind of clothing that told you nothing. No badge clipped to his belt. No lanyard. No agency windbreaker with block letters across the back. He crossed the lobby without hurrying, without looking around, and stopped at the front counter, like a man who had already decided exactly how much of his morning this would cost him. Deputy Trevor Hayes looked up from the intake log. "Morning. What can I do for you?" "I need to speak with Sheriff Warren Briggs," the man said. "Directly. It concerns a federal security matter, and it needs to be handled today." Hayes set down his pen. In 11 years at this office, he had heard the words federal and security used mostly by people who wanted a parking ticket dismissed. But this man had said it the way you'd report a gas leak. Flat. Unemotional. Already past the part where he expected to be doubted. "And your name?" "Jack Sullivan." "Sullivan. All right." Hayes waited for the rest of it. It didn't come. "And you're with—" Sullivan shifted the leather bag to his other hand and glanced once at the ceiling corner where a camera sat behind a plastic dome. Then at the row of chairs by the window where an older woman waited with a citation in her lap. "I'm not able to discuss that here," he said. Deputy Malcolm Reed had come out of the break room halfway through and stopped by the copier with a coffee cup in his hand. He was younger than Hayes, heavier through the shoulders, and had a way of listening to strangers that already assumed the ending. "Not able to discuss it," Reed repeated. "In a police station." "In a public lobby," Sullivan said. "There's a difference." Reed set the cup down on the copier lid. "Buddy, everybody who walks through that door has a reason they can't say something out loud. Usually, it's because there's a warrant attached to it." Sullivan absorbed that, without any visible reaction. He set the folder on the counter and turned it so the label faced Hayes, but he kept 2 fingers resting on the cover. "I'm not asking either of you to take my word for anything," he said. "I'm asking for 10 minutes with the sheriff behind a closed door. If he tells me at the end of it that I'm wasting his time, I'll leave, and none of you will ever hear from me again." Hayes looked at the folder. It was thick, professionally tabbed, the kind of documentation nobody assembled on a whim. He picked up the desk phone. Warren Briggs had run this county for 19 years. He had the build of a man who'd played something contact in high school and never entirely lost it. And he moved through his own building with the unhurried confidence of someone who had never once had to introduce himself in it. He came down the hallway with his sleeves rolled and his reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, and he sized Sullivan up before he'd finished crossing the lobby. "Warren Briggs, you wanted me." "Jack Sullivan, thank you for coming out." Sullivan pushed the folder an inch toward him. "Sheriff, I need you to do one thing before we talk about anything else. I need you to preserve access to your emergency communications network. Freeze the administrative credentials log. Everyone out, and don't let anyone touch the server room until we've had a conversation." Briggs looked at the folder. He did not pick it up. "That's a hell of an opening." "I know how it sounds." "Do you?" Briggs pulled his glasses down, flipped the cover, and turned 2 pages. The way a man turns pages when he's already decided the contents don't matter. Access logs, a network topology diagram, timestamps highlighted in 3 different colors, photographs of a server rack that Briggs recognized because it was 40 feet from where he was standing, halfway through one name, repeated often enough that it caught. Cross Systems, the technology contractor that had come in 2 years earlier to modernize the county's dispatch and emergency radio infrastructure. Sullivan had circled it in the margin of one page, but he had not written a conclusion next to it. He hadn't decided yet whether the company was a party to anything or simply the door somebody else had walked through. Briggs closed the folder. "Where'd you get this? That's part of what I can't discuss out here." "Uh-huh." Briggs slid the folder back across the counter. "Let's try an easier one. Who do you work for?" "Sheriff." "It's not a trick question, son. Federal building, federal badge, federal letterhead. Any of those. Pick one, and we'll go from there." Sullivan's expression didn't change, and that seemed to bother Briggs more than an argument would have. "I'm asking you for a closed room," Sullivan said. "Everything you want to know, I'll answer in a closed room to the extent I'm permitted to answer it. What I'm not going to do is stand in your lobby with a civilian 8 feet away and describe the vulnerabilities in your own network out loud." Reed made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "He's been doing this the whole time, Sheriff. Real mysterious." Briggs didn't take his eyes off Sullivan. 19 years had taught him a reliable rule about men who came in refusing to identify themselves. They were either lying about something or building toward asking for something. And either way, the refusal itself was the tell. He had used that rule 1,000 times. It had almost never failed him. It was failing him now, and he couldn't see it. "Here's my problem," Briggs said. "You walk into my house. You tell me my systems are compromised. You tell me to shut down the network that this county uses to send fire trucks to house fires. And when I ask you the single most basic question a man in my chair can ask you, tell me you're not permitted. You understand how that reads from where I'm standing. It reads like I'm hiding something. It reads exactly like that." "I know," Sullivan said. "And I'd rather it read that way than have this conversation in front of a camera feed I haven't verified." That landed wrong. Briggs heard it as an insult to his building, which was almost what it was. He stripped, and the room's temperature changed by a degree. "You've got a problem with my cameras now. I have a problem with any device on a network I've been told may be compromised, including the one recording this conversation. Sheriff, that's not an accusation about your department. That's the whole reason I'm standing here." The older woman with the citation had stopped pretending not to listen. Hayes noticed. He also noticed something else which he wouldn't think about carefully until much later. Sullivan had asked for a closed door 4 separate times, and Briggs had turned down every one of them without once asking what was behind it. 10 minutes, Sullivan said again. "That's the entire request." Briggs pushed his glasses back up onto his forehead. "You'll get your 10 minutes when you give me a name I can call to verify who I'm giving them to. That's not me being difficult. That's the job. There's no number I can give you that would satisfy you in the next 10 minutes. Then we don't have anything to talk about." "We do," Sullivan said. And for the first time there was something underneath the flatness. Not anger. Urgency held on a very short leash. "Sheriff, listen to me. There is a serious vulnerability in your system right now. Not last year. Right now. Every hour those administrative credentials stay live is an hour somebody may be using them. I am asking you to freeze access and preserve your logs. That's it. You don't have to believe a word I've said about myself to do that. It costs you almost nothing, and if I'm wrong, you turn it all back on tomorrow morning and file a complaint about me." Briggs looked at him a long moment. And if I'm wrong, Briggs said, I've knocked out dispatch for a county of 40,000 people on the say-so of a man who won't tell me his employer. You want to be the one explaining that to a family whose call didn't go through. That's a fair question. I know it's fair. That's why I asked it. Then here's mine, Sullivan said. If I'm right, and you do nothing, who explains that? The lobby went quiet enough to hear the copier fan. Briggs had been sheriff long enough to know the difference between a man who was frightened of him and a man who simply wasn't. Sullivan wasn't. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't stepped forward, hadn't done a single thing that could be written up. He had just stood there and refused to be handled, and in 19 years of running this building, that was the one thing Warren Briggs had never learned how to tolerate. You're done, Briggs said. Sheriff, you've disrupted my front desk for 25 minutes. You've got a civilian sitting right there, listening to you. Tell my deputies our radios don't work. You've refused repeatedly to identify yourself. He turned his head slightly. Reed. Reed was already moving. Sheriff. Hayes said it quietly, one hand still on the folder. He hasn't done anything. He's done plenty. Disorderly conduct. Hayes kept his voice down, but he didn't move his hand. He's been standing at a counter talking. Briggs looked at his deputy, and Hayes understood that the decision had stopped being about Sullivan somewhere in the last 2 minutes. Book him, Briggs said. Cell 3. Sullivan didn't resist. He didn't argue, didn't invoke anything, didn't reach for a phone. He set the leather bag on the counter himself before anyone asked and stepped back from it with his hands visible. Reed took his arm. Anything sharp on you? No. Anything I need to know about, everything in that folder, Sullivan said. Nothing on my person. They walked him back through the door beside the counter. The hallway smelled like floor wax and old coffee. Cell 3 was the last one on the left, empty, with a steel bench and a drain in the concrete. At the door, Sullivan stopped and turned to Hayes, who had followed with the folder still in his hands. Deputy, 2 things. Hayes waited. That folder does not go into an evidence locker, and it does not get scanned, copied, photographed, or entered into any system in this building. It stays in your physical possession until someone with the authority to take it from you does. Not the sheriff. Not it. No one. That's not really how. I know it isn't. I'm asking anyway. Hayes looked down at the folder. Then he tightened his grip on it, and he didn't say yes, but he didn't put it down either. Reed swung the door shut. The lock engaged at 10:58 in the morning with the flat metallic sound that everyone who works in a jail stops hearing after the first month. Sullivan sat down on the bench, straightened one cuff, and looked at the clock mounted high on the corridor wall. Reed watched him do it, and found it irritating in a way he couldn't name. You waiting on somebody, Sullivan? Sullivan kept his eyes on the clock. Somebody coming to get you, big lawyer federal cavalry. Reed leaned a shoulder against the bars. Because from where I stand, you're a guy in a cell who wouldn't say who he works for. That's it. That's the whole story. They'll call. Reed waited for more. There wasn't any more. They'll call, Reed repeated. Sullivan didn't answer him again. He just watched the second hand come around, the way a man watches something he has already counted. Reed walked out shaking his head and told Hayes on the way past that the guy was a fantasist. Hayes said nothing at all because he was still holding the folder and had not in the last 4 minutes been able to make himself set it down. Warren Briggs went back to his office and closed the door. I was not in that moment a man wrestling with his conscience. He was a man who had settled something. 19 years had given him a clear picture of how his county worked. People came in with problems. They explained themselves, and he decided what happened next. Sullivan had refused the first 2 steps, and tried to skip directly to the third, and Briggs had corrected it. He'd let the man sit for a few hours, let him decide whether being cooperative was worth more than being mysterious, and by dinner, the whole thing would resolve itself the way these things always did. He signed 2 payroll forms. He answered an email about a road closure on the county line. He drank half a cup of coffee that had gone cold on the corner of the desk sometime during the conversation in the lobby. And once, without quite meaning to, he thought about the folder. Not the man. The folder. The tabs had been numbered. The timestamps had been highlighted in 3 colors, which meant 3 separate categories of something. There had been a network diagram of his own building drawn to a level of detail that Briggs himself had never seen, and he had signed the purchase order for that network with his own hand. He set the coffee down. The phone on his desk rang. Briggs looked at the display. No number, no name, no area code. Just an empty field where the origin should have been, which he had seen exactly twice before. In 19 years, both times. During a federal exercise the county had been ordered to participate in and told nothing about. He picked it up with the flat irritation of a man expecting a robocall. Briggs. Sheriff Warren Briggs. Speaking. Who is this? Sheriff Briggs, this is the White House Situation Room. Listen carefully. Briggs sat very still. Somewhere behind him down the hall, past the door beside the counter, a man he had booked 43 minutes earlier was sitting on a steel bench watching a clock. The voice on the other end did not raise itself, did not identify a person, and did not wait for him to respond. There is a man in your custody. He was brought in this morning and placed in a holding cell. You will release him immediately. His personal effects and any materials he brought with him will be preserved exactly as they are, unphotographed, and unentered into any county system. You will cooperate with the federal review already underway in your jurisdiction. Do you understand these instructions? Briggs's mouth had gone dry. I need to know who I'm speaking with. You've been told who you're speaking with. Then I need to know who he is. There was a short silence on the line, and it did not feel like hesitation. It felt like a decision being made about him. That determination has not been delegated to your office, the voice said. Release him. Preserve his materials. Cooperate with the review. Cooperate with him, or cooperate with the review. With the review. Sheriff. The call ended. Briggs sat with the receiver against his ear for 4 or 5 seconds after the line went dead, listening to nothing the way people do. He had expected the ground to give way completely. It hadn't. That was somehow worse. Whoever had called had told him to open the cell door and told him almost nothing else. No name, no agency, no authority handed to Sullivan over him. The man was not by any instruction Briggs had just received in charge of anything. Briggs put the phone down and stood up. I was going to open that door. He didn't have a choice about that. But as he walked down the hallway, Hayes, still holding the folder, passed, Reed rising slowly out of his chair, with a question forming on his face. Warren Briggs was already telling himself the thing that would cost him everything. He's still just a man who wouldn't say who he was. The lock on cell 3 turned at 11:41 in the morning. Sullivan stood without being told to. He stepped out into the corridor, adjusted his cuff again, and looked at Briggs, the way a man looks at a door he already knows is closed. Sheriff, you're free to go. Briggs held the door open longer than he needed to. There's been a misunderstanding this morning. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. I'd like my bag and the folder. Hayes has the folder. Nobody's touched it. Briggs let the cell door swing shut behind them. Now I've got a question, and this time you're going to answer it, because I've had a phone call about you, and it didn't tell me a damn thing. I know roughly what the call told you. Then you know it didn't tell me who you are. It wasn't authorized to. How did they even know? Briggs stopped walking. You never made a call. You never asked for one. I had a check-in window at 11:30, Sullivan said. I've had one every day for the last 9 days. When I missed it, somebody at the other end had to decide whether I'd gone quiet by choice. He started down the hallway again. They decided I hadn't. Hayes was standing at the counter with the folder pressed flat under both hands, exactly where he'd been an hour earlier. Reed hovered by the copier with the expression of a man who had been told the punchline and still didn't find it funny. Sullivan took the folder, checked the tab order with 2 fingers, then set it back down open to a page of timestamps. Now, he said, the thing I asked for this morning. Freeze administrative access to the communications servers. Log out every active session. Nobody in or out of that room until we've imaged the drives. No, Briggs said. Hayes's head came up. You just got a call from the White House, Sullivan said. I got a call telling me to let you out of a cell and cooperate with a federal review. It didn't tell me to hand you my department. Briggs planted a hand on the counter. You want me to knock out the backbone of my dispatch on an unverified suspicion? That's not caution. Sullivan, that's a decision with consequences, and I'm the one who signs for them. Every minute those credentials stay live. I heard you the first time. Briggs tapped the open page. Cross Systems. That's what half this file is about. That's the company that rebuilt this county's radio network 2 years ago under a contract I signed after a competitive bid, an audit and a background review that took 4 months. Gavin Cross has sat in my office. When the tower on Route 9 went down in an ice storm last winter, he had a crew out there before the roads were clear. I haven't accused Cross Systems of anything. You've circled it 11 times. Because it's the largest external party with credentialed access to your system, Sullivan said. That's not an accusation. That's arithmetic. Briggs straightened and looked past him down the hallway toward the small room with the glass insert where the department's technology ran. Here's what's going to happen. I'll cooperate with your review. I said I would, and I meant it. But before I take a hammer to my own operation, I'm going to have my own man look at it. Nobody touches that room until Howard's finished. That's your freeze, and that's all of it you're getting. Sheriff, don't. Howard's been running this department's systems for over a decade. He set up half of it himself. If somebody's been inside my network, he'll find it in an hour. Briggs turned toward the hallway. Vance, my office. Sullivan's jaw tightened by a fraction, and Hayes was the only one who saw it. Howard Vance came out of the technology room, with his glasses on a cord and a coffee mug that said, World's okayest it guy. The kind of joke a man keeps on his desk for 11 years because everyone in the building has stopped seeing it. He was pleasant and slightly rumpled and knew every deputy's password recovery question by heart. Briggs explained it in about 90 seconds. Vance listened, nodding, and took the folder page Sullivan had left open. These are our access logs, Vance said. They are, Sullivan said. I'd like you to explain 3 sets of authentications on them. 2:12 in the morning on the 4th, 3:06 on the 11th, 1:50 on the 19th. All administrative, all from a workstation that isn't yours. Vance studied the page over the top of his glasses. Give me an hour. I'd rather image the drives first. Sheriff. Vance looked past Sullivan directly at Briggs, the way an employee does when he wants everyone to remember who the employer is. Take your hour, Briggs said. It took him 50 minutes. Vance came back into the office with a printout and the easy manner of a man delivering good news to his boss. There's no intrusion. He set the pages down and turned them around. Those 3 authentications are maintenance. All 3 fall inside scheduled service windows. Cross Systems does a firmware push on the radio controllers overnight, so it doesn't interrupt daytime traffic, and when they do it, they authenticate against the admin group. That's how the contract's written. It's been that way since the install. Briggs looked at the printout, then at Sullivan, and something in his shoulders eased. The workstation, Sullivan said. Terminal in the equipment closet. It's on the admin group because the controllers are physically racked in there. Anybody doing hands-on maintenance is going to authenticate from it. Vance shrugged, apologetic, almost gentle. I understand why it looks strange from outside. It looked strange to me the first year. It's just how the vendor works. May I see the raw event data, not the summary, the system-side record? That's what I just showed you. That's a report you generated. Briggs put a hand flat on the desk. Enough. Sullivan, he answered your question. He answered it in 50 minutes, with documentation, which is 50 minutes, and a document more than you've given me all morning. He pulled the printout toward himself. Server room goes back to normal. Vance goes back to work. Sheriff. Sullivan leaned forward, and for the first time that day, his voice had weight in it. If I'm wrong, you lose nothing. You turn everything back on tomorrow, and you write me up. If you're wrong, every minute we've spent in this office is a minute. Somebody has been inside your network with an open door, and now knows a federal review is happening. That asymmetry is the entire argument. It's the only argument I've made all day, and it's a hell of a convenient one, Briggs said. Because it means I can never tell you no. There's always another minute. That's true, Sullivan said. It's also not a reason. The two of them looked at each other across the desk, and the thing that had started in the lobby finished forming. Sullivan wanted the system sealed before anyone proved anything. Briggs wanted something proved before he turned his department upside down. Neither position was stupid. Only one of them was being made by a man protecting his own authority, and he was the one who couldn't see it. Vance carried the printout back down the hall, and nobody watched him go except Sullivan. At 2:17 in the afternoon, Sullivan asked Hayes for a workstation on the guest network and a chair, and Hayes gave him both without asking Briggs. At 3:50, Sullivan stopped scrolling. He went and stood in the door of Briggs's office without knocking. Sheriff, I need you to look at something. Briggs came down the hall with the expression of a man being asked to look at something for the second time in one day. Hayes followed. Reed came too because by then, everyone in the building had stopped pretending to work. Sullivan had two windows open, side by side. This is the log segment I brought with me this morning. I pulled it 11 days ago through an external mirror. This is the same segment as it exists on your server right now. Briggs put his glasses on. They're not the same, Hayes said. They're not, Sullivan said. 41 entries are missing from the live copy. All of them from the same 3 overnight windows. Briggs read it twice. Vance cleaned up noise. He'd have said, look at the modification time. Briggs looked. The timestamp read 12:19 in the afternoon. The building went quiet in a specific way that Hayes would remember for years, because he did the arithmetic in his head at the same moment the sheriff did, and neither of them said it out loud for several seconds. That's today, Reed said from the doorway, in a voice that had lost all of its earlier confidence. That's 38 minutes after I walked out of cell 3, Sullivan said. While the 4 of us were standing in the lobby arguing about whether Cross Systems does firmware pushes at night. Briggs took his glasses off very slowly. You're saying somebody deleted those entries this afternoon. I'm saying somebody deleted them 38 minutes after this building learned there was a federal review. That's not an old trail, Sheriff. That's not a 2-year-old contractor doing overnight maintenance. Somebody in this county knew what was happening as it was happening and moved to destroy the record of it. Briggs sat down on the corner of the desk. He was not a man who sat on furniture. How many people can do that? Sullivan turned the screen. On this system, modification of admin group event logs requires elevated rights. There are 4 accounts with that privilege. 2 are service accounts that haven't authenticated interactively in 14 months. 1 is a legacy account belonging to a supervisor who retired in March, disabled since. He let Briggs read the 4th line himself. That's the list. Briggs read the 4th line. Howard Vance. No. Sheriff. No. Briggs stood up off the desk. Howard has worked in this building for 11 years. He fixed my computer at his own kitchen table the weekend my mother died because I couldn't get the funeral home paperwork to print. You're telling me that, man. I'm telling you what the privilege table says. Credentials get stolen. You said that yourself this morning. That's the whole reason you wouldn't talk in front of my cameras. Somebody could be using his login. That's possible, Sullivan said. It's genuinely possible. And if it's true, Howard Vance is the most important witness in this building. But there's something you're not accounting for, and it's the reason I stopped what I was doing and came to find you. Briggs waited. 50 minutes ago, Howard Vance stood in this office and told you there was no intrusion. He built that conclusion on a log he had already altered. He handed you a summary and refused me the raw data. Then he walked out of here with your permission to keep working on the system. He cleared himself. Sullivan closed the laptop. Sheriff, whether he did this himself or somebody's wearing his account, the person we're looking for isn't only outside this building. Somebody inside it is protecting him. Reed had gone entirely pale in the doorway. Briggs looked at the closed laptop for a long moment. Everything he had done since 1141 had been built on a single load-bearing assumption that his own house was clean and only the stranger was suspect, and the stranger had just handed him a timestamp. "Hayes," Briggs said, "lock the building." "Sir, nobody in, nobody out. Get somebody physically standing at the server room door, and I want it to be you." He was already moving. "Read radio room. Every device log it, don't touch it. Don't shut anything down until Sullivan tells you how." "Where's Vance right now?" "Technology room," Hayes said. "He was there 10 minutes ago." "Then go stand where he can see you, and don't make it look like anything." Reed went, and this time he didn't say a word on the way out. Briggs turned back to Sullivan, and for the first time all day, the question he asked was not about identity. "How much of it is gone?" "I don't know yet." "Guess." "I don't guess, Sheriff." Briggs put both hands on the desk and leaned on them. "This morning you asked me for one thing. Freeze the credentials." He said it slowly, like a man reading his own handwriting back. "And at 11:41, after the White House called my desk, you asked me for the same thing again. And I gave it to Howard Vance to check." "Yes." "You could say it." "There's nothing to say that helps," Sullivan said. "The building's locked now. That's what matters in the next hour." He opened the laptop again and went back to work. And Warren Briggs stood in the middle of his own office with the specific vertigo of a man discovering that the thing he had been protecting all day was not his county. By 4:30, Sullivan had reconstructed enough of the deleted segment from the external mirror to see the shape of what had been removed. The 3 overnight authentications were real. They were also only the visible edge. Underneath them ran a pattern of sessions that did not touch the radio controllers at all. They reached past the controllers through the trunk that connected the sheriff's network to the county's shared emergency infrastructure and into the segment that carried coordination traffic for protective details. Transport scheduling and federal movement notifications routed through regional dispatch. That was the part Sullivan had not been permitted to describe in a lobby that morning. He explained it to Briggs in the hallway outside the server room in about 4 sentences without a chart, and watched the sheriff understand it. That's why the call came from where it came from, Briggs said. Yes. How long has that door been open? At minimum since the 4th of last month, possibly longer. That's what the missing entries would have told us. Hayes was standing at the server room door with his arms folded, and he had been listening to all of it. Sheriff, he said, Vance is asking to leave. Says he's got a dentist appointment at 5. Briggs looked down the hallway toward the technology room, where the light was still on, and a man he had known for over a decade was putting his coat on. Tell him the building's locked, Briggs said. Tell him I'm sorry about the appointment. Hayes went. Sullivan turned back to the rack of blinking equipment behind the glass, and Briggs stayed where he was looking at the same door. The story had changed shape in the space of one afternoon. That morning, the only question in this building had been, who is this man, and why won't he say? Nobody was asking that anymore. There was a new question now, and it was worse because it had an answer, and the answer was somewhere inside these walls. Someone here had held the door open, and the man who had spent an entire day refusing to let anyone shut it was standing in the hallway, finally certain of it, and already too late by a margin he could not yet measure. Howard Vance did not go quietly back to his desk. By 5:15, with the building locked for over an hour, and Hayes standing at the server room door, Vance had worked out exactly how much trouble he was in, and he started doing the only thing he knew how to do. Sullivan watched it happen in real time. Timestamps on 3 archive directories shifted by increments of hours. A batch of controller diagnostics got flagged as corrupt and queued for automatic purge. A workstation in the records Annex 1 nobody had logged into since spring suddenly authenticated against the admin group and began pulling files. That's not his terminal, Briggs said, reading over his shoulder. No, it's Deputy Reed's. Reed came off the wall. I've been standing in the radio room for the last hour. I know, Sullivan said. That's the point. He's copying a credential onto an account with an alibi, so that when this gets reconstructed, there's a second name in it. Briggs's hands closed slowly on the back of the chair. Sullivan stopped chasing the deletions and went sideways instead. He stopped looking at what Vance was destroying and started looking at why a man with 11 years of clean service would destroy anything at all. Working from the external mirror and a set of records the Federal Review already held, he built a second file, and this one had no network diagrams in it. It had payments, 19 months of them. None of them large. None of them direct. A consulting fee routed through a limited liability company in an adjoining state that existed on paper and nowhere else. A second entity that shared a registered agent with the first, and behind both of them holding a minority interest that had taken 3 separate filings to surface Gavin Cross. Sullivan printed it and laid the pages on Briggs's desk one at a time, and Briggs read every line without saying anything. He didn't sell you out for the money, Sullivan said. Not at the beginning. Look at the first payment, $4,000. That's not the price of a police department. That's the price of a favor. What favor? A standing credential. Cross Systems wanted persistent administrative access, so they wouldn't have to file a change request every time they needed to touch the controllers. Vance opened it. In his head, he did a vendor a courtesy and got paid for the inconvenience. Technical data. Firmware. Nothing that meant anything. Briggs turned a page. And then he found out. Somewhere around the 4th month, based on the traffic, he'd have seen sessions that went past the controllers and into the trunk. That's the moment he had a choice. Sullivan set down the last sheet. If he'd walked into your office that day and told you he'd have lost his job and probably faced charges. So he told himself it would stop. Then the next payment came. Then the one after that. By the time he understood what he'd actually opened confessing wasn't a career risk anymore. It was a federal indictment. So he kept taking the money and kept cleaning the logs, and every month he did it. The reason he couldn't stop got heavier. Briggs looked at the printout of the first $4,000 transfer for a long time. "He fixed my computer," he said, "the weekend my mother died." "Both things are true, Sheriff. That's usually how it works." At 7:20, the federal team arrived. 9 of them, 2 vehicles, no markings, and they moved through the sheriff's office like men who had done it in 40 other buildings. The one in front crossed the squad room without looking at anyone, stopped in front of Sullivan, and waited. "Sir, we're yours. Where do you want us?" Briggs heard it from 6 feet away. Nobody said a title. Nobody produced a badge. But the man leading a federal response team had walked past the elected sheriff of the county without a glance and gone straight to the man Briggs had put in a cell that morning and had asked for permission before touching anything. Hayes was standing close enough to see the sheriff's face change. "You want to ask?" Hayes said quietly. "No," Briggs said. "I think I just got my answer." They sealed the server room, imaged every drive on site, and pulled Howard Vance out of the technology room without raising a voice. I gave it up in under an hour, in a borrowed interview room, with the pages Sullivan had assembled sitting face up in front of him. He named the accounts. He named the arrangement. He described the moment he'd realized what was moving through the trunk, and admitted he had said nothing. And when he was asked why, he said the only honest thing he'd said all day, which was that he'd been afraid. But he had done one more thing before they took him, and Sullivan found it at 8:40. A message sent at 4:52 that afternoon from a personal device to a number outside the state, routed through a channel that had been sitting inside a legitimate software update package since the install. 4 words. Federal Review. Shut it down. Sullivan read it and did not move for several seconds. Hayes, watching him, understood that this was the first thing all day that had actually landed on the man. "That's 47 minutes after we locked the building," Hayes said. "Yes. I was standing at his desk. You were 20 feet away." "He didn't need the network," Sullivan said. "He needed 4 words and a phone in his pocket." The federal team spent the next 2 hours reconstructing what had left the network, and at 10:51, a technician named Dana Whitcomb turned her screen around in the middle of the squad room, and everyone in it stopped talking. "We've got outbound volume in 4 concentrated windows," she said. 2 of them are historical. 2 of them are today. Briggs came closer. "The first block today runs from 10:58 in the morning to 11:38. She let that sit. "The second runs from 12:19 to 4:55. Nobody said anything because everybody in the room had already done the arithmetic, and Warren Briggs had done it fastest. 10:58 to 11:38 was cell 3. Not most of it. All of it, 12:19 to 4:55, was the afternoon he had handed the investigation to Howard Vance. "How much?" Briggs asked. Whitcomb gave a number in gigabytes. It didn't mean anything to most of the room, so she translated it. Enough to include the coordination segment, movement notifications transport, scheduling the protective detail, routing that comes through regional dispatch. We won't know exactly what's in it until we finish the differential, but we have to assume the worst version." "And where did it go?" "Through a relay chain. 4 hops we can see. We don't have the end point." Sullivan was looking at something else on the screen. "Dana, session table." She pulled it up, and her expression changed. There was a live connection. Gavin Cross was still in the system. Right now. At 10:53 at night, with a federal team standing in the building, and Howard Vance in an interview room down the hall, someone was inside the network pulling files. "He got the warning at 4:52, Sullivan said quietly. He's not running. He's finishing. Briggs stood very still, with his hands at his sides. He had been given 2 chances. That morning a man had asked him for a closed door and 1 freeze order, and Briggs had put him in a cell for refusing to explain himself. At 11:41, after the Situation Room called his desk, that same man had asked for the same thing again, and Briggs had handed it to Howard Vance instead. Not because the evidence was thin, because the alternative meant admitting that a stranger understood his building better than he did. Both windows on that screen had his name on them. "Sullivan," he said. "What are our options?" Sullivan laid it out flat without softening it. They could cut every external connection immediately. That protected whatever hadn't left yet. It also killed the live session, and with it, the only path back to the man on the other end. Cross would vanish. Everything he'd taken would stay taken, and the investigation would spend 2 years chasing shell companies. Or they could leave the connection open. Let the federal team work the relay chain backward, while Cross was still authenticated. That gave them the endpoint and direct evidence tied to a live intrusion. It also gave him more time inside the system. How much more could he get? Hayes asked. Depends how long it takes to trace him. Briggs turned around. Every instinct he had was screaming to shut it down. Cut the wires, seal the room, stop the bleeding. He had made 2 decisions that day, out of the need to be the man who decided. And both of them had cost hours that people would eventually be able to measure in consequences. He looked at Sullivan, standing over a laptop in a building where he had spent 43 minutes in a holding cell that morning. "It's your call," Briggs said. The room shifted. Reed looked up. Hayes looked at his sheriff and did not recognize him. "Sheriff, I've made 2 calls today, and I got both of them wrong," Briggs said. "I'm not making the 3rd one. You've been right since you walked through that door, and every person in this room knows it. It's your call, and whatever you decide, my department does it." Sullivan looked at him for a moment. Then he turned back to the screen. "We're doing neither," he said. "Dana, how fast can you stand up a mirrored environment?" Whitcomb was already typing. 20 minutes if I clone the directory structure." "Do it. Nothing real inside it. Populate it with dummy sets built to the same schema, so the file sizes and naming conventions match." Sullivan turned to Hayes. "Deputy, I need every essential channel moved to the backup infrastructure before we do this. Dispatch, fire, medical. If a call comes into this county tonight, it goes through the fallback, and it does not touch the primary. Nothing we're about to do can put a single resident of this county at risk. That's the condition." Hayes went. At 11:40, they made the cut. Gavin Cross's session was quietly rerouted into a copy of a network that no longer held anything. And for 11 minutes, he kept working inside it, pulling directories, moving through the structure, with the confidence of a man who had walked these paths for 2 years. Then he stopped. "He's checking a hash," Whitcomb said. "How long?" "Seconds." The session went still, and then everything happened at once. Cross began tearing down. He dropped the first relay in the chain, and it went dark on the board. He started issuing deletion commands against his own staging directories. Whitcomb's team was working the trace backward through the remaining hops, and the hops were disappearing faster than they could resolve them. "Third node's gone." "Second." Briggs stood behind Sullivan and did not say a word. "He's going to make it," Reed said. No, Sullivan said. "Dana the last hop. He hasn't cut it." Whitcomb saw it a half-second after he did. "He's still verifying." "He can't let go of it." Sullivan leaned in. "He spent 19 months and every dollar he paid Vance to get that archive. He won't burn the confirmation path until he's certain what he pulled tonight is intact. That's the one thing he can't do fast." "How long do you need?" Briggs asked. "Ask her." Whitcomb didn't look up. 40 seconds, maybe 50. He'll be gone in 20, Reed said. Then we give him a reason to stay. Sullivan was already typing. Dana corrupt one file in that. He's verifying. 1. Make it look like a transfer error, not a trap. If he reads it as a trap, he won't. He'll read it as a bad copy, and he'll re-pull it because he can't leave with a hole in the archive. She did it. The last node stayed live. Cross reached back into the mirrored environment for a file that did not exist in any meaningful sense, and while he was pulling it, the trace resolved. An address. A physical location 410 miles away, tied to a service account, tied to a registered agent, tied to 19 months of transfers into an account belonging to Howard Vance. Got him, Whitcomb said. Close it, Sullivan said. All of it. Now, every external path into the sheriff's network dropped at 11:58. 410 miles away, a man who had spent 2 years inside a county-wide emergency system watched it go black and did not have time to do anything about it. They took Gavin Cross at 4:20 in the morning, along with 3 drives, 2 laptops and the staging server. He hadn't finished wiping. Howard Vance was charged with accepting payments in exchange for unauthorized access, with concealing a known intrusion, and with destruction of evidence, the last of which he had committed while standing in his sheriff's office holding a coffee mug that said, "World's okayest it guy." The wider investigation didn't end there. Somebody had been buying what Cross was selling, and finding out who took longer than any of it, and belonged to people whose names never appeared in the county at all. But the door into the sheriff's office was shut, and the man who had held it open was in custody. 2 days later, Warren Briggs stood in front of every employee in the building. He did not blame Howard Vance. He said that a man had walked in on Tuesday morning with a folder and asked 4 times for a closed door and 1 freeze order, and that he had refused every time, and that the reason he had refused was not procedure. He said it out loud to 40 people in the room. Where he had run this county for 19 years, he had refused because the man wouldn't explain himself, and because a sheriff who lets a stranger tell him what to do in his own building stops feeling like a sheriff. He said that he had been given a second chance at 11:41 that morning after a call from the White House Situation Room, and that he had used it to hand the investigation to the one person in the county who most needed it buried. He said the data left the network during the 43 minutes a man sat in cell 3, and during the 4 hours he spent afterward protecting his own authority, and that no apology had any business anywhere near that sentence. Then he changed the department's procedure for handling sensitive warnings. Put administrative privileges under quarterly external review, and put 1 line on the wall by the front counter where every person who walked through the door would see it. Listen before you label. Some months later, Jack Sullivan came back to the county on another federal matter. He came in the same way he had the first time through the front door, carrying a leather bag, wearing nothing that identified him. Hayes saw him first and was already on the phone. Briggs came down the hallway and was on his feet before Sullivan reached the counter. Nobody asked him who he worked for. Nobody asked him to prove he mattered. When he said he'd prefer to talk somewhere private. Reed walked over and opened the conference room door without being told, and did not make a joke about it, and never would again. Briggs stopped for a second before he followed him in, and looked down the hallway toward the door beside the counter. Cell 3. For 19 years, those bars had meant he was the man who decided who was right and who was wrong in this county. He had walked past them every day and felt nothing at all. Now they meant 43 minutes on a Tuesday morning, and a quiet man watching a clock waiting for a call he had never once mentioned he had earned. Jack Sullivan had never needed a title to be worth listening to. It took a call from the White House Situation Room to teach Warren Briggs the thing he should have understood the day they gave him the badge. Power doesn't make a man right, and silence doesn't make another man small. Listen before you judge, because sometimes the person you're in a hurry to dismiss is the only one trying to stop you from making the worst mistake of your life.